Before we begin, it is important to clarify something. This talk was not created to accuse anyone. It is not meant to judge personalities, categorize people as good or bad, or place moral labels on human behavior. Instead, this lecture asks a quieter, more difficult question. Why do some people seem unable to resolve conflict? Why do certain relationships become tangled webs where words never travel directly between people, but instead circulate indirectly distorted, refracted, and amplified along the way? Many of us have asked this question at some point in our lives. You may have found yourself thinking, why doesn't that person simply speak directly? Why do they carry messages between people instead of addressing the issue openly? Why does every disagreement somehow grow larger after passing through them? At first glance, such behavior can look manipulative or even malicious. But both philosophy and psychology offer a more nuanced explanation. They remind us of something fundamental about human behavior. Most actions are not driven by conscious intention, but by survival strategies learned long ago. In other words, people rarely behave the way they do because they wish to create harm. More often, they are repeating patterns that once helped them survive emotionally. The purpose of this lecture, therefore, is not to attack individuals who generate conflict. Rather, it is to examine the hidden structures through which conflict emerges and sustains itself. Because if we fail to recognize the structure, we will spend our entire lives repeating the same patterns, only with different faces, different names, and different circumstances. Today, to understand that structure, we will begin with a simple question. Why do some individuals seem to escalate conflict rather than resolve it? The answer, surprisingly, is rarely found in the present moment. It is often buried in a psychological climate that was formed very early in life. A childhood without stable rules. Imagine a child growing up in a home where the rules constantly change. One day watching television is allowed. The next day it leads to punishment. One evening, bedtime is strictly enforced. The next evening, no one seems to care. Meals, discipline, expectations, everything depends not on consistent rules, but on the emotional state of the caregiver. In such an environment, the child does not experience life as predictable. Instead, the child learns something very different. The world is unstable. Safety is uncertain. One must always remain alert. Children raised in stable households gradually internalize a sense of order. They learn that actions lead to predictable outcomes. But the child raised in a fluctuating environment learns something else entirely. They learn that security does not exist. What exists instead is constant emotional tension. And the most important thing to understand is this: that tension rarely disappears in adulthood, when direct conversation feels dangerous. As adults, individuals raised in unpredictable emotional climates often experience something unusual. When conflict arises, when two people sit face to face to discuss a problem, they feel a sudden surge of anxiety. The situation unconsciously resembles childhood moments when emotional reactions were unpredictable, and so they avoid direct confrontation, not because they enjoy conflict, but because direct engagement feels psychologically unsafe. Instead, they choose another strategy. They introduce a third person. Rather than speaking to A, they tell B, A said something about you, and then they return to A with another message. B seemed upset about what you said. At this point, something crucial must be understood. The accuracy of the message is almost irrelevant. The real function of this behavior is to redistribute tension. By spreading emotional pressure across multiple relationships, the individual removes themselves from the center of the conflict. Psychologists often call this pattern triangulation. Within a triangular structure, conflict rarely disappears. In fact, it often intensifies. But for the person who created the triangle, the arrangement serves a psychological purpose. It keeps them from being the sole focus of emotional tension. Conflict as a psychological stabilizer. Here is the paradox. For most people, Conflict is something to resolve. For individuals shaped by chronic early tension, conflict can become something different. It becomes a stabilizing mechanism. If conflict disappears entirely, something unsettling occurs. Silence. And silence can feel unfamiliar, even threatening, because their early life taught them that emotional calm rarely lasted. So unconsciously, they leave misunderstandings unresolved. They repeat fragments of conversations. They allow emotional tension to linger, not necessarily out of malice, but because conflict has become part of their psychological equilibrium. Without it, they feel strangely disoriented. The Tibetan Book of the Dead and Psychological Limbo. To illuminate this phenomenon from a philosophical perspective, let us briefly borrow a concept from the ancient text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there exists a state called bardo. Bardo describes an intermediate condition between death and rebirth, a transitional state where consciousness is neither fully released nor fully grounded in a new existence. Psychologically speaking, bardo can also symbolize a state of suspended awareness, a condition in which the mind remains attached to familiar patterns, unable to recognize them clearly or move beyond them. For individuals raised in chronic emotional tension, adulthood can resemble such a state. Calmness feels unfamiliar, but anxiety feels recognizable. And so the psyche gravitates almost automatically toward environments that recreate the emotional atmosphere it already understands. Not because those environments are healthy, but because they are familiar. When personal survival strategies enter society, individually, these coping strategies may simply make someone difficult to work with. But when they appear within organizations, communities, or social networks, the consequences expand. Rumors multiply. Interpretations replace direct communication. Responsibility becomes diluted. Instead of clear dialogue, conversations begin to circulate indirectly, and gradually trust begins to erode. This is why understanding psychological structures is so important. Without that understanding, we tend to label people quickly. They are manipulative. They create drama. They enjoy conflict. But the deeper truth is often more complicated. Many of these individuals do not enjoy conflict. They simply learned long ago that conflict was the emotional climate in which survival was possible. Understanding without surrender. Recognizing this structure does not mean we must tolerate destructive dynamics. Understanding is not the same as forgiveness. Understanding simply gives us the ability to choose something wiser than anger. It allows us to create distance where necessary and boundaries where appropriate. Because once we recognize the triangle, we no longer need to stand inside it. And that realization may be the most important step toward healthier relationships. In future discussions, we will explore additional childhood patterns that shape these dynamics, including environments of emotional volatility, conditional attention, and performance-based affection. Each of these experiences forms a different psychological blueprint, but they often lead to the same result: relationships that cannot remain stable without the constant presence of tension. And the more clearly we understand these patterns, the less likely we are to become trapped inside them ourselves. If this perspective helped you see human relationships in a new way, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this lecture with others, because sometimes the most important insight we can gain is not about changing others, but about recognizing the invisible structures that shape our lives. How early emotional lessons shape the way adults create tension. In the previous part of this lecture, we explored a crucial insight. Many people who seem to intensify conflict are not necessarily malicious, manipulative, or intentionally destructive. Often they are simply repeating emotional strategies that once helped them survive. When we begin to see human relationships through that lens, an important shift occurs. Instead of asking only who is right and who is wrong, we begin asking a deeper question. What kind of emotional environment shaped this person's way of relating to others? And when we follow that question carefully, we start to uncover patterns that appear again and again in human development. Let us now examine another. Example 1 that is surprisingly common yet rarely recognized. Case 3. The child who is loved only when sick. Imagine a child growing up in a household where attention appears only under very specific circumstances. When the child is healthy, energetic, and functioning normally, life moves on quietly. There is little engagement, little curiosity, little emotional presence. But when the child becomes ill, when a fever appears, when pain emerges, when something goes wrong, everything suddenly changes. Concern floods the room. Parents become attentive. Voices soften. Care becomes intense and immediate. The child is held, monitored, worried over. And without anyone explicitly saying so, the child learns something powerful. 2 conclusions slowly form in the emotional memory of that child. First, I am noticed when I am in pain. Second, the healthy version of me is invisible. This lesson is not taught through words. It is not a conscious educational message. It is learned through repeated experience, through the body, through emotional rhythms, through patterns of attention. Years pass. The child grows into adulthood. From the outside, everything may appear normal. The person works, communicates clearly, participates in society. But inside relationships, something unusual begins to happen. When peace feels like abandonment in a stable relationship, one without dramatic emotional swings, most people feel safe. But for someone whose early experiences linked attention with distress, calmness can produce a strange unease when nothing is wrong, when no emotional waves are moving. The unconscious mind begins to whisper disturbing interpretations. Something must be wrong. Maybe this relationship is fading. Maybe I am about to be forgotten. Peace begins to resemble abandonment. And so the individual struggles to remain inside calm, one-to-one relationships for long periods of time. Not because they desire chaos, but because chaos once meant connection. The emergence of the triangle. At this moment, a subtle behavioral shift occurs. Instead of confronting someone directly or expressing a personal need, the individual unconsciously builds a relational structure that feels safer. A triangle. The structure is remarkably simple. There is the self, and there are 2 other people whose emotions become entangled. Rather than speaking directly to one person, the individual introduces a message through another. It might sound something like this. I'm not sure if I should tell you this, but someone mentioned something about you. I might be misunderstanding, but I felt worried. Notice the position this person occupies. They are not the aggressor. They are not the primary participant in the conflict. Instead, they occupy a very familiar emotional role, the fragile center of concern. And if we pause for a moment, we might recognize something. That emotional position, the vulnerable center that draws care and attention, is the exact place where love appeared during childhood. When illness created closeness, when weakness produced care. The triangle therefore serves a psychological function. It recreates the emotional environment where the person once felt seen. A philosophical lens. The Tibetan Book of the Dead. To explore this dynamic more deeply, we can briefly turn to an ancient philosophical text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This text describes a state called bardo, an intermediate condition between death and rebirth. In this state, consciousness is drawn toward whatever emotional patterns feel most familiar. Fear attracts fearful visions. Attachment generates new attachments. The mind does not necessarily move toward what is healthy. It moves toward what it recognizes. Seen through this lens, the behavior we are describing becomes clearer. For the individual whose early life associated love with distress, the most familiar emotional state is not tranquility. It is crisis, not stability, but vulnerability. And so without realizing it, the person repeatedly recreates environments where tension exists because those environments feel strangely like home. Within conflict, they feel present. Within emotional disturbance, they feel visible. From personal coping strategy to social division. Individually, this pattern may simply make relationships exhausting. But when many people operate in this way within organizations, communities, or institutions, the effects expand. Messages circulate indirectly. Interpretations multiply. Responsibility becomes blurred. No one speaks directly, yet everyone reacts emotionally. And slowly, social trust begins to fracture. The most important thing to understand here is that these individuals are rarely villains. They are not calculating architects of division. Most are simply carrying a mistaken emotional formula learned long ago. If I am not hurting, I may not be loved. Another pattern. The child who learned to read other people's moods. Let us now consider another childhood environment. Imagine a household where attention depends entirely on the emotional state of the caregiver. When the parent is happy, the home becomes warm and playful. Outings happen. Gifts appear. Conversations flow. But when the parent's mood darkens, the atmosphere changes instantly. The child suddenly feels like a burden. In such an environment, the child learns a profound survival lesson. My feelings do not determine safety. Someone else's feelings do. From that moment on, the child becomes a careful observer of emotional signals. They monitor tone, expression, posture, and silence. Instead of learning to express their own emotions, they learn to anticipate the emotions of others. When this child becomes an adult, direct confrontation becomes terrifying. Expressing dissatisfaction might provoke rejection. Stating a need might disturb someone's mood. So again, the safer alternative emerges. Indirect communication. Messages delivered through third parties. Emotions circulated rather than addressed. And once again, the triangular relationship structure appears. Not as manipulation, but as a psychological shelter. Understanding without being consumed. Recognizing these patterns does not mean we must tolerate destructive behavior indefinitely. Understanding is not submission. Understanding simply allows us to respond wisely rather than react blindly. When we see the triangle clearly, we gain the ability to step outside of it, to communicate directly, to refuse participation in circulating emotional tension, and perhaps most importantly, to maintain boundaries without unnecessary anger. Because the person standing in the triangle is often not an enemy. They are someone still living inside an emotional equation written long ago. The deeper question. So when we encounter conflict spreading through relationships, workplaces, or communities, the most important question may not be, who started this? The more revealing question might be, what emotional lessons shaped the people involved? Because hidden beneath many social divisions are personal histories of conditional attention, unstable affection, or survival strategies formed in childhood. And once we begin to see those hidden architectures, we are no longer helpless inside them. In the next lecture of this series, we will explore an even deeper layer of this phenomenon. What happens when a child's emotions themselves are suppressed, when crying, anger, or frustration are discouraged or punished? How does that early emotional repression later transform into indirect communication, distorted messages, and conflicts that seem to travel mysteriously from person to person? We will examine that question through both modern psychology and philosophical perspectives. If this lecture helped you see human conflict from a deeper angle, consider subscribing and sharing this series. Because the more people who recognize these invisible relational structures, the closer we come to rebuilding something many societies are quietly losing: the ability to speak directly and listen honestly without fear.